Patrick, I want to ask you what some of your former colleagues have said, and even maybe not even people who know you personally, but people in the environmental movement who would view you as the most appalling and horrifying apostate imaginable. And they have said things about you that you are all too familiar with, no doubt, about your motives, and you must be in the pay of industry or the nuclear industry or whatever it is. If you could sit them down and talk to them, what would you say to them?
Well, I'm not sure there's much you can say to people who have that point of view. I mean, they all know what I'm saying. I'm trying to make sense. I have nearly 9,000 Twitter followers who are engaged in conversation with me, and every once in a while someone comes in and says, "You sell out, so there's lots of ad hominem involved. I was early on by my best friend, Bob Hunter, and who turned out in the end to also be my best enemy because was a very smart guy. He's gone now, but brilliant person and fellow leader in Greenpeace in the early days. He dubbed me the Eco-Judas, which was a fairly harsh thing to say in the Christian world. But it's mostly name-calling as far as I can see. And if people disagree with you on the matter of a subject of policy, of philosophy, of science, unless they're willing to engage at a truly intellectual and honest level, I don't really have much time for it. I am not a sellout. I am a pure science philosopher all my life. My mother introduced me to Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher, when I was 15, and I've never looked back. My parents bought me the books of knowledge when I was 8, and I studied the solar system and the planets and the earth and the elements and all of that. So I'm steeped in science all my life, and it saddens me to see the scientific method being destroyed by this climate cultist movement that has overtaken the world, and which says the science is settled, as if that has any information content, or the argument is over, the debate is over. There's zero information in those statements. And when you say what science, show me the science, write it down on a piece of paper as to where the proof is that CO2 is causing warming. There isn't any. I know that from my understanding of science. And so you end up with people who simply believe that CO2 is causing the warming. They don't really have much sense generally. And coming back to Bill Mckibben, to me, Bill Mckibben represents the pure propagandist ideologue, of which there are many who are making the news these days. And of course, a long time ago, he found his fame by writing an essay called The End of Nature, which basically said that, and has started this whole idea that we're no longer in the Pleistocene Ice Age, we're no longer in the Holocene interglacial period, we're now in the Anthropocene, the age of humans. As it, on one hand, it kind of belittles the whole idea of the millennia of the Ice Age is 2.5 million years on now, and we're still in it. This is the Pleistocene Ice Age, and we are in an interglacial period in the Pleistocene Ice Age called the Holocene, and there have been many glaciations and interglacial periods within the larger Pleistocene Ice Age. And I mean, hardly anybody even knows that, and it's the most recent geological history of the Earth is this Ice Age we're in, which is very unusual. And our kids are not being taught that. They're being taught that the Earth is frying from carbon dioxide, and Bill Mckibben plays into this, and now we're in the Anthropocene, which on the one hand makes humans seem more important than they really are, and on the other hand, similarly belittles the magnitude of the time this Earth has been here and all of the things that have happened to the climate and the asteroids hitting it and, ice ages and greenhouse ages. And who knows how many kids know that 3.5 million years ago, which is a blink in nature's eye, really, compared to the 4.6 billion years of Earth history, that 3.5 million years ago, giant camels were roaming subtropical forests in the Canadian Arctic Islands, which are today barren and cold, freezing cold. But then it was warm. And as a matter of fact, we are at the tail end right now of a 50 million year cooling period since the Eocene thermal optimum. Anybody can look at this on the internet. It's there for all to see that one of the warmest periods in Earth's history, at least in the last billion years of Earth's history, was during the Eocene thermal maximum, when the Arctic and the Antarctic were forested. Where the Arctic, where there's islands, the Antarctic is actually a continent underneath all that ice, and it was forested and full of animals roaming around in it. And gradually we went into a deep freeze. 30 million years ago, the Antarctic started to get cold, and 3 million years ago, the Arctic started to get cold. The Antarctic went into an ice age long before the Northern Hemisphere did. But then, since then, for 2.5 million years, we'd had successive glaciations coming all the way down to Chicago, and in the whole northern half of Russia and all of Scandinavia, covered in, and England, covered in a sheet of ice for 80,000 years at a time. And then these 10,000 year interglacial periods, which we appear to be nearing the end of one now. And if all else goes according to plan, we will now begin a gradual 80,000 year descent into another full-blown glaciation, which is coincident with the Milankovitch cycles. Just Google Milankovitch cycle, folks, and find out about the 100,000 year cycle of glaciations, which is well documented in the Antarctic ice cores, the Vostok core, which goes back 400,000 years, and the two European science cores, which go back 800,000 years. It's there for all to see. We know what approximately what the CO2 levels and what the temperature levels, and those cores were used by Al Gore in Inconvenient Truth. He said it proves that CO2 causes the temperature to go up and down because they are highly correlated in those ice cores. But what he didn't mention, maybe it was found out later, but I think he could have found out at the time, there's actually a lag where it's actually temperature that moves first, and then CO2 goes up with temperature and down with temperature. And that only makes sense because the Milankovitch cycles are solar cycles. They've got to do with the elliptical orbit of the Earth and the tilt of the Earth. There's 3 different cycles in this 100,000 year procession. And that would more likely cause a change in temperature than a change in CO2. How is the ellipse of the orbit of the Earth going to cause a change of CO2? That's not very likely. It's likely to cause a change in temperature, though, because of differences in solar radiation. And so that change of temperature, when the temperature goes up, the oceans warm and give off CO2 back into the atmosphere, because warm water holds less gas, not just CO2, but oxygen and all the other gases, holds less gas than cold water. And then when the Earth cools, the ocean absorbs CO2. The ocean contains nearly 50 times as much CO2 as the entire global atmosphere. So a small change in oceanic CO2 makes a big change in atmospheric in terms of percentage. So that's the real truth of what's been going on for the last couple million years. And none of our children are being taught this anymore. The carbon cycle is being taught as if it's pollution when we put CO2 into the atmosphere, when in fact, when we burn fossil fuels, we're just returning carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which plants removed from it in the first place. It was there before it got made into fossil fuels. It was in the atmosphere. And through most of the history of life, CO2 has been much higher than it is today. And during the height of the last glaciation, when the oceans absorbed a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere, it went down to 180 parts per million, which is only 30 ppm above the death of plants. Because not only does life require carbon dioxide in the environment to exist, this would be a dead planet if there was no CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere, it requires a certain level, just like we need a certain level of oxygen to breathe. It's not, at 10% oxygen in the atmosphere, we would more or less be asphyxiated because we need the 30% that's there. We need above 20%, really. And so plants need above 150 ppm CO2 to survive. And as the way things were going, and I'm just publishing a paper on this now, CO2 has been going down for 140 million years in the global atmosphere due to the deposition of calcium carbonate from marine organisms that build shells to protect themselves. The coccolithophores at the very low level of the plankton, very tiny things, but they produce millions of tons of calcium carbonate by using carbon dioxide that's dissolved in the sea. And over the years, CO2 has declined to a level where it's becoming dangerous. And here we come along, and if you use the metaphor of the atomic clock, we've come along at 34 seconds to midnight and put some CO2 back into the atmosphere again, thus replenishing the carbon cycle. So we are actually saviors rather than destroyers of life on Earth. And it's an amazing story, and it needs to be told, and that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my life doing.
Hi, everybody. Today's episode comes to us courtesy of one of my supporting listeners. You can become a supporting listener at supportinglisteners.com, and in the private Facebook group that we have, one of them suggested our guest today. And the more I looked into this person, the more I said, yes, this is a real natural for the show. And the guest that I'm referring to, of course, is Judith Curry. Judith Curry is a professor and former chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She'd been a professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and she's also held faculty positions at Penn State, Purdue, and the University of Wisconsin at Madison. She's the co-author of Thermodynamics of Atmospheres and Oceans and co-editor of Encyclopedia of Atmospheric Sciences. And I'm talking to her today because she has had some things to say about the data regarding global warming that is at odds with the reigning orthodoxy. So I want to talk to her about her views, and I want to talk to her about the professional consequences and what this has meant, how she's been treated. Are we, in fact, dealing in the scientific community with people who are just dispassionately pursuing the truth, and when they come across somebody who disagrees, well, they just have an academic and scholarly disagreement, and they manage the dispute one way or another? We're going to see exactly what really happened to Judith Curry. You can find out more about her at judithcurry.com. That's Curry. And I will, of course, be linking to her website at tomwoods.com/555. Judy, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
One of my astute listeners wrote to tell me that I had to talk to you, that you had a very interesting story, and I'm sorry to say I'm so uninvolved in the issue of climate change. I mean, I'm just the average American in that respect. I have a working knowledge of the issues at stake, but that's about it. I'm sorry to say I was not familiar with your situation and your work, but now I am. I have been briefing myself. I've been reading interviews and blog posts and articles about you. Wow, very interesting what's gone on with you, especially since the so-called ClimateGate fiasco of, I guess, was that 2009?
Yes, late 2009.
That was a situation where some emails were made public, and it looked, to the general public anyway, as if within the, let's say, climate change community, there was, let's say, less absolute fidelity to scientific truth than we might hope for. And other people said, oh, it's been exaggerated, there really wasn't anything there. But my understanding is that in the wake of that, given that the general public was a little bit wary after seeing this sort of thing, in trying to do some damage control, you reached out to some people who were scandalized by this, and this began the process by which you have been increasingly dismissed as a heretic in the whole matter of climate change. Am I getting the chronology right?
Pretty much. My concerns were that these emails revealed some very poor behavior and some instances what I would call unethical behavior. And I was, making a call to scientists, we need to do better than that. And so I was trying to, say, well, we need to, apologize and figure out how we're going to do better. And that was really perceived by many scientists as being a traitorous thing to do, which made me even more concerned about what was going on in the climate science community.
So you wound up talking to people who were skeptics of climate change. And skeptics of climate change could be people who don't believe the climate is changing, or they don't believe that human behavior has anything to do with it. I mean, there's a wide spectrum of positions that people can hold, some more tenable than others.
Well, the people that I was communicating with were people, very technical people who many were publishing scientists and who were active in the blogosphere. The one that caused the most ire was Steve Mcintyre. He was a Canadian blogger, a former mineral mining engineer who became interested in the hockey stick and started poking holes in that. He's quite a good mathematician and statistician. So the people I was engaging with were people like that, people who were digging into the data, had technical backgrounds and good, mathematical skills. So this wasn't just, people who were, wildly unknowledgeable and, had a religious or a political position on it, but who were concerned about the quality of the data and how it was being analyzed. And I thought it was important that we should engage with these people and see what they had to say. And again, that was regarded as a traitorous thing to have done.
Now, so a word like traitor has been used, a word like heretic has been used. Now, as a person who's a non-scientist, as I say, I wouldn't try to jump into the science of the matter, but my skeptical instinct is aroused when words like heretic and traitor are thrown around in scientific discourse. Then that's when I feel like something's going on here that's not quite, Francis Bacon and pure collection of data.
Exactly. This behavior and the ClimateGate emails triggered a lot of people's BS detector. They might not have been paying attention prior to this, but all of a sudden they started paying attention. And ClimateGate and the reaction to it actually brought a lot of other technical people outside of the climate field into the fold, starting to look at the data and even the models in some instances, and raising critical questions. And some of these outsiders, if you will, went on to publish papers in the technical peer-reviewed literature. So there's like a new cadre of people in the game, that are outside the control or the tribe of, the academic scientists who were trying to keep control of the subject.
Can you tell us exactly what is your so-called heresy in the minds of, let's say, let's call them the enforcers of orthodox opinion?
Well, what I did back in 2009 is I raised the issue that the IPCC and the consensus scientists were overconfident in their findings and weren't properly taking into account uncertainty, both in their assessments and in their communications to the public, the media and policymakers. So I raised that concern, and people didn't like that at all.
That's it?
Pretty much. That, and talking with, the skeptical bloggers, that's pretty much, and I started digging into, aspects of the science that I saw the IPCC was overconfident. And the one that I focused on early on was whether humans were the dominant factor in causing the warming since 1950. How well did we know that? I found what I regarded to be some circular reasoning, and the climate models were telling us, well, it's 100%. Okay, but I don't think that you can defend that statement. And so that, this is the kind of thing that should be discussed and debated, under normal circumstances. But because of how politicized all this has become, making a statement about scientific uncertainty is regarded as a political statement, along, the merchants of doubt mean, like anybody who's questioning this is in the pay of big oil and is therefore biased. And then there's this automatic connection with anybody talking about uncertainty and climate change that they must be in the pay of big oil, which is absolutely ludicrous.
Among the general public, most people have been, I think, intimidated by this 97% statistic that is just thrown around ad nauseum to shut people up. As far as you know, what's the origin of that statistic, and what does it mean?
Well, it doesn't mean very much. President Obama has been tweeting this, and it features prominently on his website. The one that President Obama's been tweeting is a study where a group of individuals categorize abstracts from scientific publications and put them in two piles, whether they supported the consensus and whether they didn't. Most papers, it's hard to tell because that's not really what they're talking about. But the people who were doing the categorization not only were they untrained, but they were also associated with an advocacy group. But some of the papers that they included as supporting the consensus were ridiculous, like a paper about the adoption of cook stoves in India, for example, was a paper that was categorized as supporting the consensus. So it was a completely ludicrous paper that has been widely criticized in the published literature as well as on blogs, but people still talk about it. And it's a very vague consensus, like climate change is real, climate change is happening. Well, of course, climate change is happening. Climate has always changed. Nobody disagrees with that. By that token, I'm a member of the 97%. So it's a meaningless statistic. Now, if you actually survey climate scientists, and you ask, well, are humans causing most of the warming? Well, depending on exactly how you ask the question and who you ask, you get agreement with that statement somewhere between 52% and 85%. So of the scientists. So there's a majority who do agree with that, but it's nothing close to 97%. So,
well, what do you think the trend has been over the past, say, 10 years? Is it toward more skepticism of this claim, or is it toward more consensus?
It's hard to know. I would say probably more skepticism, but the surveys haven't been very good until very recently. So, I think there are increasing challenges to the consensus position. But it's hard to know. But, in a very complex, uncertain subject like human-caused climate change, how many people agree versus how many disagree, I don't think is very meaningful. I mean, there's a lot of disagreement and there's a lot of uncertainty, and you just need to factor that into however you're going to decide to deal with the problem.
I'd like to ask you about a few particulars. Senator Ted Cruz has been a bit of a lightning rod on the subject of climate change, and he had a now notorious interaction with the president of the Sierra Club. I don't know if you saw that on YouTube.
Yes, I did, yeah.
And the president of the Sierra Club had to keep asking staff to answer whether he knew certain things. Do you know what the term the pause means? And he has to turn to them, and then he turns around and says, yes, I do. Well, okay. You'd think you could answer that question yourself. But what Cruz kept saying was that the satellite data over the past 18 or so years shows no significant warming, and the response from the president of the Sierra Club was, I side with the 97%. Well, the 97% do not deny the satellite data, so that's completely irrelevant. But what I want to ask you is, what about I don't know what your opinion even is of this, but what I've read is that the satellite data is not the beginning and the end of the question. There are other measurements of the warming of the planet that reveal other answers. So how do we figure out what the correct one to use is?
Well, you have to look at all of them. Okay, how the atmosphere responds is different than the surface, is different than the ocean. at various depths. So looking at all that data helps you understand how heat is being transferred through the climate system. And by looking at all the different data sets, it gives you a sense of the uncertainty, how well we can even measure any of this stuff. So, I'm in favor of looking at all the credible data sets. And again, it brings up the uncertainty issue. I mean, if the data sets are disagreeing in major ways, it means there either has to be some physical explanation for that, or there's more uncertainty in these measurements, than the scientists have characterized.
Well, is there anything to the idea of the pause?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's been a slowdown in warming since, depending on which data set you look at, since 1997 or 2001. It's a little bit different for some of the different data sets, but there's a slowdown. There's one data set that doesn't show a slowdown, and that is the recent NOAA reconstruction of the surface temperature data set. This came out last July and was very controversial. So trying to understand why the NOAA data set is different than the other data sets is ongoing. But again, to me, this highlights that the uncertainty in all of this data sets is greater than people are currently assessing.
But if the worst case scenario is an almost apocalyptic one, then how do you respond to people on the extreme end of the policy debate who would say, given that the stakes are so high, we can't afford to wait for the data to clarify themselves. If we have some data pointing toward the possibility of significant warming, then we've got to take action now rather than wait 50 years and say, oh, you know what, it is significant warming, and then it's too late. How do you respond to that?
Okay, well, the issue, two issues. Let's assume for the sake of argument that the climate models are right. Okay, and that the only way we're going to slow this down is to stop emitting fossil fuels. Well, you have to ask the question, is the right strategy to impose regulations and to get people to use existing technologies, mainly solar and wind, that aren't up to the task? They're not going to, replace fossil fuels and nuclear power, or spend your resources on developing new technologies. I mean, is the current regulatory environment basically slowing down energy innovation? I suspect that it is. So, and the cure could be worse than the disease if rapid transition away from fossil fuels damages the economies or prevents the developing countries from developing. Well, then we're more vulnerable to the ravages of climate change. So is the best defense to really develop economically so we can afford to protect ourselves? So there's all these questions, even if you believe the results of the climate models. And even if you do, all these commitments that have been agreed to and made, for the Paris Conference of Party meeting that, just concluded yesterday, even if those agreements are actually met, which I find very dubious, is that they would only prevent a fraction of the so-called dangerous warming. Most of the benefits of that would, by the end of the 21st century, most of the benefits of those reductions would be seen in the 22nd and the 23rd centuries. It's not going to help anything or much at all in the 21st century. So if this is really a big problem, should we be spending our resources on figuring out how to deal with the problems that we'll face in the 21st century? So these are all the dilemmas that you face, even if you believe the climate model projections. Okay, and then if you don't believe the climate model projections, then that opens up a whole host of other issues. So there's no silver bullet solution. I mean, thinking that this treaty is going to solve anything or that wind and solar can actually do the job, I think we're fooling ourselves. So if this really is a problem, we don't have solutions, that can deal with it right now.
Judy, I'm curious about the evolution of your own work. So if I were to look at work of yours from a long time ago and compare it to your work from today, what differences would I see? That's what I want to ask you after we pause for this message. If you've got an online business, you know you need landing pages, sales pages, upsell, downsell, webinar pages, squeeze pages where you get people's email addresses, sometimes in exchange for giving them a free ebook or whatever. You need thank you pages. These take a long time to create. You got to pay designers and developers, or you have to subscribe to expensive services. But thankfully, with Funnel Kit Go, you don't have to do that anymore. You can cheaply but beautifully and very easily, with just a few mouse clicks, create all these pages you need. Plus, they're throwing in as a bonus a great plugin called Social Funnels, which helps you build an email list quickly and efficiently, which is the central ingredient in your online marketing. Plus, they're giving all the profits just through December 17th to poor children in the form of Christmas gifts. Come on now. If you need a landing page builder, now's the time. TomWoods.com/funnel. If you guys like console or handheld games, then GameFly is for you. Because with GameFly, you've got a huge selection of games that can be delivered to your door cheaply. Instead of buying 2 to 3 games a year, you can play all the games you like by using GameFly. Plus, they deliver the games on the release dates. So if you're looking forward to that new release, no more standing out in front of the store at midnight. Get a 30-day free trial through tomwoods.com/game. Let me ask you this. Suppose I were able to read scientific papers and I dug up something that you'd written, let's say 20 years ago. How would it be different from something I might read from you more recently?
Okay, the papers I was writing 20 years ago dealt with physical processes of a small part of the climate system, like the albedo of Arctic sea ice or the reflectivity of clouds or, things like that. It was dealing with little pieces of the physical system. So nothing in what I was writing, say prior to 2010, was grappling with the big issues like what is causing global climate change, or, what will the 21st century climate look like? I mean, starting about 2005 or so, I started looking at natural climate variability, particularly the multi-decadal oscillations. So I started that line of research around 2005. And again, nothing that I was publishing back then really raised anyone's hackles, but it laid the foundation for some of my more recent work, which is focused on natural climate variability.
All right, so given that you hadn't been writing about that until relatively recently, did you nevertheless have strong opinions on it, or did that come only when you really started digging into it?
No, I didn't have strong opinions. In fact, prior to ClimateGate, I felt that the responsible thing to do was just to accept the consensus of the scientists. Don't listen to what one scientist says. Look at what these 1,000 scientists have to say after years of careful assessment. So I bought into that argument until I read the ClimateGate emails and I became aware of the sausage making and the borderline unethical behavior that went into creating and forcing and even bullying people into the consensus. So I said, okay, I need to look at these things from scratch and do my own thinking on these larger problems, which is what I've been doing for the last 5 years.
How have you suffered professionally as a result of all this? I know you've been called names and there's a lot of negative press attached to your name. You're a tenured professor, so you can weather some of this, but what have been some tangible effects?
Well, I am a tenured professor, so I'm not at risk of losing my job. After I stepped down from chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, I had in mind to seek another administrative position. While I got a lot of interviews, it quickly became apparent that I was unhireable, largely because of the controversies surrounding me. And if you Google Judith Curry, you see all these outrageous things on the first page. Judith Curry abandons science.
Yeah, but see, as soon as I saw that, because I've been attacked in the same way by people who are just as hysterical, right away I was sympathetic to. I thought, I know exactly the type of person who launches attacks like that, who can't just say, we're having a sober scientific disagreement. It has to be Manichaean.
Right.
The devils versus the angels. These people are incapable of rational discussion.
Right. So if somebody's looking to potentially hire me and they see all this and go, oh, gosh, we don't need this baggage.
Right. And they don't even care to adjudicate it. They don't want to deal with it.
Right. And everybody wanted to interview me. I've got a lot of good ideas and a lot of things to offer. And the headhunters thought I was great. But at the end of the day, nobody was going to offer me an administrative position. So, that's no particular big deal. I don't have a problem getting my papers published, getting grant proposals funded for anything other than something that is dotting I's and crossing T's. I can't get anything meaningful funded. I basically had to change my peer group. I've redefined my peer group. I'm networked with a broader group of scientists from a range of different fields, including economists and philosophers and whatever, and people from varying walks of life. And so I have a much more interesting network now that I've sort of stopped trying to, be accepted and judge myself by what my academic peers think of me. So in some ways, my current activities are more interesting and rewarding, but by conventional academic measures, I've killed my career. But I don't care. I'm enjoying myself, and I think I'm having an impact, and I'm doing interesting things.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Now, on the other hand, one thing that people would point to and say, well, you're just making things worse on yourself is you have accepted invitations from Republican congressmen to testify before Congress saying things that the people attacking you would not want you to say. So you're just adding fuel to the fire by doing that, they might say.
Oh, I'm sure they do. But that's ridiculous. I'm interested in getting the best information out there, highlighting the uncertainties and bringing some alternative analyses to the table. And I think people need to consider this, policymakers, the media, other academics. So I think I'm trying to open up the debate, both on the science and related to the policy options. And so testifying, in front of Ted Cruz's committee, I think extends my influence in that regard.
I want to ask you just one last thing before I let you go. If people who are critical of you because for your views, and they attribute bad motives to you, they can't think of how you could hold your views honestly. It must be for some venal reason, and they can't find anything in your funding, so it's entirely speculative, or who knows what they think. But it can't be that we just have an honest disagreement over interpretation. That is just ruled out by a lot of people. Now, on the other hand, what would you say is the primary motivation behind them? Are these people just they just have a pure scientific disagreement with you, and they just are badly behaved people, or do you think they are motivated by their own political motivations?
Okay, well, anybody criticizing me, I'm just behaving like a scientist. I'm questioning the evidence and challenging and re-examining conclusions. If that doesn't define the job of a scientist, I don't know what does. So the people criticizing me have some sort of agenda that goes beyond science. And, there's, many complex reasons for that, their own personal political preferences. There's lots of things reinforcing the consensus from within the profession. Funding, recognition, their authority and their seats at big tables. So it's a... All
right, well, that provokes another question. I'd like to know if this experience has changed the way you look at not science in the abstract, not pure science that's absolutely disinterested and interested in pursuing only the truth, but science as it's actually practiced under modern regimes in the Western world. Is it not exactly the pure, dispassionate pursuit of the truth that the average layman is told that it is? Is it a more complicated picture? Have you drawn some conclusions about that?
Oh, it's a very complicated picture, and that really relates to the topics that I've been writing about the last 5 years, is about expertise and what influences people thinking from within their expert domain, how people become biased, the interface between climate science and policy, and even the philosophy of science as it relates to climate science. So these are the things that I've been investigating over the last 5 years. And it's a very complex issue. And I'm very gratified to see more social scientists and philosophers become engaged in this study, although many of them bring the same kind of baggage to their investigations that we see among climate scientists. So how to have objective people looking at this whole issue remains a considerable challenge.
Well, I hope people will check out judithcurry.com. I'm going to link to that at tomwoods.com/555, where I will also link to a couple of posts by you that give people a big picture overview of what you've been saying and what the consequences have been. It seems to me like there's a really good book somewhere in all this. Is that on your radar at all?
Eventually, yeah, I am thinking about writing some books.
Yeah, good. That would be fun to read. Well, anyway, listen, I'm really grateful for this. Initially when a person suggested that I contact you, I thought, well, I tend to shy away from scientific topics when I'm not immersed in the literature. I want to talk about things that I know really well. But I thought, well, one thing that I do seem to know is how things like this can become politicized. And I'm interested in people's own experiences in academia and how it's not always the dispassionate ivory tower that we imagine it to be. So I'm grateful for your, well, frankly, courageous position that you've taken, and I wish you the best of luck.
Okay, thank you. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
All right, tomwoods.com/555 is the place to go. Tomorrow, you know what's coming up. You know what's coming up. It's the old post-debate analysis show with Lou Rockwell and me, and it'll be great and fun, and it's a guilty pleasure, but nobody has to know that you're listening, right? It's just, I'm not going to say a word. So definitely tune in for that. But you know what? Let me tell you something quickly. I'm a softie. I think that comes through a little bit on the show. I'm a softie. So I'm going to throw in a free book. You can pick any book, well, sort of any book, if I've got copies of them. Most of my well-known ones I have copies of. But I'll throw in a free autographed book to you if you buy a gift subscription to libertyclassroom.com before Christmas Day 2015. After you buy the subscription, just write to me at tomwoods.com and tell me which book you'd like, and I'll sign it to you. Now, I can't guarantee them for Christmas delivery, so this can't be an extra present for your recipient, but it's a thing for you. So you get something back. You get something too. And if you have bought a gift subscription anytime already in the month of December, write to me at tomwoods.com if you would like a free book signed to you, and I will get that baby right out to you. tomwoods.com/books is where you can find them all. And subscribe at libertyclassroom.com. Get that gift subscription, and you get an extra bonus. It's like those gift cards. You buy $25 in gift cards. You get a $5 gift card for yourself, but you don't tell your recipient that. You just pocket that baby. You pocket this book. No one will be any the wiser. So there you go. GOP debate analysis tomorrow. See you then.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.